for the ways that we get to be a part of that story. We pray, Lord, that as we turn our attention to your word at this point, Lord, that you would use this time to shape our lives. Open our eyes and our ears and our hearts and our minds that we might receive what you have to say to us, and that we might know more fully and deeply what it means to be your people, to be called to serve you and to be a part of what you're doing in your kingdom in this world. In your Son's name we pray these things. All this week at Rock Creek Elementary, Micaiah and his classmates have been celebrating Space Week. And so they've had a lot of activities geared toward introducing them to a lot of space-related concepts like quasars and black holes and dwarf planets, and sparking their young imaginations with the possibility of one day exploring that vast uncharted darkness that lay beyond our atmosphere. As I've been getting updates throughout the week and getting the things that teachers have sent home and seeing the projects that Micaiah has been doing, it's taken me back to that time in my life, a few decades ago, when some of these same ideas grabbed a hold of me. I think every kid goes through that phase at some point when they watch a shuttle launch, where they memorize the planets in the solar system, gaze up through a telescope for the first time, and they dream about strapping into a rocket-propelled capsule someday and hurtling towards the moon, or linking up with the space station. I was no different. But as I got older, as I entered my teenage years, I left a lot of that behind. I pursued new interests. I got distracted by a whole variety of adolescent pastimes, so that the excitement of space exploration and all the imagined adventure that came with it kind of just faded away. But then during my senior year of high school, I picked up a book by an author that I had recently discovered, Tom Wolfe. And the book was called The Right Stuff. Some of you have probably read the book or seen the movie. And from the moment that I read the first few pages, I was hooked. In his electrifying prose, Wolfe narrated the story of the early days of the U.S. space program, the race against the Soviets, the technological triumphs and failures that dotted our path to the moon. But more than any of that, what made this book one of the best things I had ever read were the characters, the pilots that NASA turned into astronauts and that Wolfe turned into superheroes. Gus Grissom, Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Buzz Aldrin. So reading about their childhoods, reading about their home lives, about the rigors of their training and the danger of their missions, I remember being struck with the realization that these men, these guys who made history and achieved immortality and swaggered into the adoring imaginations of every American who encountered them in the glow of the television or the ink of the newspaper, were at the bottom of everything real, living, breathing people. They had a gift. They had the confidence that came with that gift, but they also had flaws. They could accomplish things that no human being before them had ever done, but they were still human beings. In Wolfe's words, they had the right stuff, but they were still capable at times of doing the wrong thing. Over the past couple of months, we've been journeying through the story of the Bible, the narrative of God and his people. And even though we're not at the halfway point yet, we've already encountered some amazing things. From God's powerful acts of creation in the Garden of Eden, to his powerful acts of liberation in Egypt. From God's provision in the wilderness to his victory in the Promised Land. But throughout it all, the most amazing thing that we've encountered, the most amazing thread that runs through this narrative, is God's loving faithfulness. And the way he continually reveals that loving faithfulness to human beings, whether through the covenant promises he makes to Abraham or through the law that he gives at Sinai. God promises to be a God who is for his people, a God who is with his people, and who refuses to break that promise, even when those people do everything in their power to keep him at a distance. This is something worth rejoicing in, even as it brings us to our knees in grateful humility. Today, as we continue this journey through the story, we come to one of those extended episodes in the history of God's people that remind us of the lengths that God will go to in order to remain faithful, even when his children are anything but. the book of Judges, a series of stories sandwiched in between the conquest of the Promised Land and the birth of the Israelite monarchy, narrates a tumultuous time in Israel's history. It was a time when these people were struggling to figure out who they were, and more often than not, they were expressing that struggle in disobedience to God's most fundamental commands. The book of Judges opens after Joshua's death, discussing the difficulties that Israel had in driving various Canaanite tribes out of the land. It talks about how these people and their gods became a stumbling block for the children of Abraham. The book closes with the sentiment that in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. And in between this opening and this beginning, we see a cycle repeated over and over again. The people sin grievously against the Lord. They follow the foreign idols that should have been detestable to them. God allows their enemies to conquer them. And for a while they groan under the oppression of the Amorites or the Midianites or the Philistines. And then God raises up for them a deliverer, a man or woman who will serve to lead them out of their subjugation and back to independence, where after a brief period they will begin to sin just as grievously as they had before. And these judges, these men and women leaders whose stories are told in the 21 chapters that make up this book, like Tom Wolfe's astronauts, they're larger than life. They're fascinating characters, gifted warriors, charismatic leaders. But they're also human beings. They have some of the same triumphs and failures that we have. They have some of the same qualities and flaws that mark us, the same obstacles and challenges that we face. And so as we look at their lives, as we learn something about their missions before God, we can also learn something about our life. We can learn something about our mission as well. So as we look briefly at the stories of just a few of these judges today, whom we encounter in the Bible, it might help to clarify that the word judge, with all its modern connotations, probably isn't the best way for us to picture who these people were. If we're coming at this text with notions of American jurisprudence and images of a staid, dignified legal scholar in a flowing black robe, we're probably not going to grasp fully what the lives of these leaders, the special vocations of these men and women were all about. It's probably true that at least the best among them did have a commitment to God's law. They did have a desire to see that law carried out among their people. But their primary role doesn't seem to be one of judicial debate. Instead, these judges are leaders in a more general sense and in a more active sense. In most cases, they're warriors of some kind. The word that this book uses for them most often is the word deliverer. Their position wasn't intended to be an elected one. They weren't decided on by the will of the people. They were chosen by God, usually at a time when the will of the people was broken and untrustworthy. The most distinguishing characteristic of these judges is that in their better moments, the Spirit of the Lord was at work in their lives, except when it wasn't. And that's when things could really go sideways for them and for the people of God. So the main thing to keep in mind as we look at the judges is that they were a mixed bag. They were a diverse group with different skills and different personalities and different levels of success when it came to leading the people of God. I think it's helpful in approaching this part of the story to acknowledge this and to reflect a little bit on how these characters were different from one another and what we might learn from each of them. So very early in the book, we encounter the judge whose career as a judge is perhaps the most distinguished of all, at least in terms of how the book presents her. I'm talking about Deborah. Deborah, the author of Judges, tells us was a prophet. This means that she had a gift of discernment. She had a commission to proclaim the word of the Lord, to speak truth to people who usually didn't want to hear it. The Spirit of God worked within her in a special way. It infused her life and her work with a divinely ordained wisdom that would shape and guide her community. During a time of oppression at the hands of a Canaanite king named Jabin, we read that Deborah held court under a palm tree in the hill country of Ephraim. So the Israelites would come to Deborah, and she would help them settle their disputes. She was clearly a respected leader among the people. She was a stable presence in a difficult time. She's so respected, in fact, that when she speaks to an Israelite soldier named Barak, saying, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give them into your hand." Barak makes it plain that he will not enter the battle unless Deborah goes with him. Now, it wasn't every day that a fighting man like Barak in a warrior culture like Israel would call upon a woman to help him fight his battles. But Deborah clearly is a special woman in her time and in her place. She has led the people with the help of God's Spirit in peacetime. And so Barak wants her by his side during the violent conflict ahead. Deborah agrees, but she makes it clear that because he has hesitated in this way, his legacy is going to be an ambiguous one. "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah, "but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours. For the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." And that's exactly what happens. But not in the way that Barak assumes, not in the way that we, the readers, assume. We probably assume that this means Deborah is going to be the big hero of the story. And Deborah undoubtedly serves as an important guide for the army of Israel. She serves as a spiritual commander as they enter the battle. But the death blow is delivered by a minor character, Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, who lulls Sisera to sleep in her tent and then kills him with a tent peg. So God delivers his people in an unexpected way through the work of two women, Deborah, the faithful prophet, and Jael, the quiet assassin. And in the end, Deborah's true character is revealed. She gives God the glory for the victory that he has achieved. Judges chapter 5 records one of the most stirring songs of celebration in all of Scripture, the Song of Deborah. It concludes with a powerful proclamation of Deborah's commitment to lifting up the name of the Lord. She says, "So may all your enemies perish, Lord, but may all who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength." Then we read, "The land had peace for 40 years. But this peace, as we see over and over again in the book of Judges, will not last. Because in the next generation, the children of Israel once again forget their commitment to God. They once again turn to idols, and God once again gives them into the hands of their enemies. This time the Midianites and Amalekites invaded and ravaged their land. And once again they cried out to God, who responded by raising up a deliverer. This young man, Gideon, wasn't cut from the same cloth as Deborah. He wasn't a respected prophetic figure known for his wisdom and discernment. No one was coming to Gideon for advice. He even says that he's the least among his people, which are the least among the tribes of Israel. No one was asking Gideon to provide support in battle. Gideon's most distinguishing trait, at least when we first meet him, is a sort of anxious timidity. An angel finds him threshing wheat in his winepress, hiding out from those who would forcefully seize his crops from him. When the angel calls Gideon to lead the people, he responds by asking for a sign. Actually, he asks for a series of signs. He wants to be sure that it is truly God who is calling him. You may have heard this story before. Gideon first puts a fleece on the ground, and he asks that God would make the fleece wet with dew and the ground around it dry. God does this. Then Gideon says, "Let me ask for another sign. This time make the fleece dry and the ground around it wet with dew." God does this. He patiently confirms to Gideon that his call is indeed from the Lord. Now, before we're too hard on Gideon, it's fair to say that this hesitation is something we've seen before. It's certainly the same kind of hesitation that Barak had when Deborah called him. It's the same kind of hesitation Moses had at the burning bush when God spoke to him from the flames of fire and told him to go lead his people out of Egypt. It's probably the kind of hesitation that many of us exhibit when we feel God calling us to have a hard conversation or to reach out to someone in a difficult way, let alone to lead an army against a destructive and oppressive fighting force. It's also important to acknowledge that once Gideon believed that God was calling him, Gideon was all in. Even when God whittles his army down from 32,000 to 10,000, and then from 10,000 to 300. At that point, as his own forces shrank and as the Midianite hordes began to look more and more imposing, Gideon had to be questioning what he had gotten himself into. But Gideon stayed. Gideon trusted. And God responded by delivering the army into his hands. God caused the Midianites to flee at the sound of the Israelite trumpets. God clearly won the victory for his people through a tiny army and the hesitant, halting leadership of the unlikeliest of heroes. And then there was Samson. Samson was the last of the Israelite judges. He is probably the most famous of the Israelite judges. In some ways, he's the most likely candidate for greatness among this collective of ancient heroes. Samson had the right stuff, or so it seemed. Samson is also one of the worst examples of a leader that we encounter in Scripture. Samson is one of the sorriest wastes of God-given potential that we encounter throughout human history. This was a guy who, from an early age, was set apart for greatness. Samson was a Nazirite. He was born under a distinctive vow of holiness, and he was endowed with a kind of superhuman strength. Samson could rip city gates from their posts. He could slaughter an entire army with a donkey's jawbone. No Philistine could overcome him, and no prison could hold him. But he was also a slave to his lusts. He was a captive to his pride and vanity. Samson was his own worst enemy. We've probably all heard the story of how Samson told the secret of his strength to a Philistine woman named Delilah, how she cut his hair and handed him over to his enemies. But Samson was defeated long before that, because the humble faithfulness that Deborah had exhibited, the trust in God that Gideon had eventually demonstrated, the kinds of qualities that God wanted the leaders of his people to possess, these things were all conspicuously absent in Samson's life. In their place was a kind of growing sense that he was invincible, that his strength would always be enough for him. It wasn't until all of that was taken away, it wasn't until his hair was gone, his eyes were gouged out, and he was languishing in a Philistine prison, that Samson began to realize who he truly was. A child of God, set apart for something bigger than himself. The story of Samson comes to its tragic, melancholy conclusion in Judges chapter 16, where we read, "Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and to celebrate, saying, 'Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands.' When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, 'Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain.' So instead of Deborah's song to the Lord, song of victory, Samson's life leads to the point where Israel's enemies are singing praises to their God. While they were in high spirits, they shouted, 'Bring out Samson to entertain us.' So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, 'Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so I can lean against them.' Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there. And on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, 'Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes.' Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, 'Let me die with the Philistines.' Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived." In that humble prayer, when Samson finally calls on God from a place of utter dependence and weakness, Samson seems to realize that God is the one in whom he should have relied all along. And with that prayer, his strength returns, and a victory, a victory of sorts. It's a bloody victory, it's a gruesome victory, but a victory is accomplished. And despite the fact that Samson dies with his enemies, this may be the only real victory over the Philistines that he ever achieved. Because it came not from a place of arrogant pride, but a place of helpless trust. See, the book of Judges is in many ways one of the most tragic chapters in God's story. In these 21 chapters, we encounter the constant, cyclical, stubborn nature of human rebellion against the God of creation. And yet, even in the midst of this, I think that one of the reasons this book is so dark, one of the reasons it is so tragic, is because it reminds us that even in the midst of this, we can see God at work. Through the faithful discernment of Deborah, through the anxious trust of Gideon, and ultimately through the helpless submission of Samson. We can see the way that God uses all types of people, those who are obedient and those who struggle, the weak and the strong, the likeliest of heroes and the unlikeliest deliverers among us, those who have the right stuff and those who have nothing to offer but are failures. My hunch is that precisely because Judges is such a mixed bag of personalities, we can find in this book something of ourselves. We can discover some way that God is working among us as he fulfills his purposes and as he continues to tell his story through the lives of his children. Please pray. God, we thank you that your word is full not just of stories of triumph, not just of stories of people who have it all together and who always do the right thing, but Lord, your scripture is also full of stories of weakness, failure, struggle, and sin. Because, God, when we look at our lives, that's what our lives look like a lot of the time, too. We don't always have it all together. We don't always win. We don't always triumph. More often than not, we feel overwhelmed and intimidated. We feel like we're losing a battle each and every day. But, God, we thank you that even in the midst of that, your strength is revealed. Your power to sustain us, to help us to overcome those things which are the enemies in our lives. Lord, these things do not overcome us because, as your word says, if you are for us, who can stand against us? Help us to remember that, Lord, when we look at the stories of the Judges, that in no way, shape, or form is it their strength. In no way, shape, or form is it their power that helps them to achieve the victory. It's only when they submit to you, when they trust in you, when they walk in your path, that their enemies are defeated. Help us to cling to that reality in our own lives as well. It's in the name of your Son, Jesus, that we pray these things.